bullets flew at the White House Correspondents Dinner. But the real war for America's future is actually being waged with invisible lines.
Yeah, we just witnessed a, highly visible, terrifying grab for control. But the true battle for power, well, that happens completely out of sight.
Right, because look at the sheer chaos at the Washington Hilton. I mean, shots ringing out in this crowded ballroom.
Utter panic.
Secret Service agents just swarming the stage and instantly evacuating President Trump. That's the kind of thing that completely stops the country in its tracks.
And the details emerging are, well, they're deeply unsettling, honestly. Authorities detained the suspect, this 31-year-old guy named Cole Allen.
Right.
And on paper, he looks like this massive success story. He's a Caltech graduate, someone who recently won a Teacher of the Month award in California.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but then investigators found his 1,000-word manifesto.
And that's where it gets really dark.
Exactly. He actually describes himself as a friendly federal assassin.
A friendly assassin. That is, that's chilling.
It really is. His writings detail this intense rage against the current administration's policies. He was specifically targeting Trump officials.
And he didn't just walk in blindly. Right.
Yeah, not at all. Most alarmingly, he documented security breaches at the hotel beforehand. He found weaknesses that made smuggling firearms inside far easier than he ever expected.
It's a shocking, violent event, and it absolutely dominates the headlines.
As it should.
Right, as it should. But extreme events like this shooting, they're really just the loud, visible explosions of political rage.
Yeah, the surface level stuff.
Exactly. The underlying structural battle for control of our government is happening quietly. It is happening on maps. So welcome to this deep dive into the actual mechanics of redistricting.
It's going to be a good one. Today we're pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources for you. We have breaking news reports from the Wall Street Journal, detailed academic papers from New York Law School.
Lots of legal jargon in those.
Oh, tons of it. We also have investigative analysis from the Fulcrum, commentary from the conservative outlet Hot Air, and strategic planning documents directly from the National Democratic Redistricting Committee.
So our mission today, based on all these sources, is to uncover exactly how politicians draw lines to pick their voters.
Right, instead of the other way around?
Yeah. We're going to look at the massive partisan arms race to control the map, and we're going to ask whether a truly fair system is actually even possible.
Which is a vital question because the maps dictate literally everything else that happens in our democracy.
So we have to start with the actual tools used to secure this political power. We are talking about manipulating the 14th Amendment.
Right, so the 14th Amendment gives us that bedrock principle of one person, one vote.
Everyone's vote should carry the exact same weight.
Exactly. But politicians, they found a brilliant, completely legal-looking way to bypass that principle without breaking the underlying math.
It's sneaky.
Very. They use two highly sophisticated tactics, and they're called packing and cracking.
The actual physical mechanics of gerrymandering. So let's start with packing. How does a map maker pack a district?
Well, so packing happens when map makers take a specific demographic group, say voters who reliably vote for the opposing party, and they basically just shove as many of them as possible into a single district.
Okay, I like to think of packing kind of like a sports stadium. Imagine you want to ruin the experience for the visiting team's fans.
Right, the away team.
Yeah. Packing is when you take every single visiting fan and you stuff them into one tiny section of the bleachers in the upper deck.
Just cram them all in.
Right. And sure, they totally dominate Section 112. They're the loudest voices in that one specific square. But they only get to claim that one section, and their influence in the rest of the massive stadium is completely gone.
That is a perfect way to visualize the math. That concentrated group, they're going to win their single district by a landslide, maybe taking like 90% of the vote.
A huge margin.
Yeah, but by trapping all those voters in one place, the map maker exhausts their voting population. Their influence is completely drained from all the surrounding areas.
So the map maker's party can then win 5 neighboring seats by narrow, 51% margins.
Exactly. They sacrifice one seat to guarantee 5 others.
Wow. And so if packing is stuffing all the visiting fans into one section, cracking is the exact opposite.
Right.
You take those same visiting fans and you assign them seats so thinly scattered across the entire arena that whenever they try to cheer, their voices are just completely drowned out by the home crowd.
Yeah, by breaking that concentrated group apart, their voting power is totally diluted. They never achieve majority anywhere, meaning they can never elect their preferred candidate.
It fundamentally feels like cheating.
It really does. Now, as our New York Law School source points out, these tactics frequently lead to massive constitutional challenges.
Because proving intent in court sounds nearly impossible, right? Like, map makers can just claim they were following natural geographical boundaries.
Oh, absolutely. They'll say, well, we just followed this river or, we use this highway as the border.
So how do the courts actually measure that someone intentionally cracked a district?
It is incredibly difficult. But a major turning point was this 1986 Supreme Court case called Thornburg v. Gingles.
Okay, jingles. What happened there?
The court recognized that when cracking is used to dilute the voting strength of minority groups, it violates Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. So they basically established a strict three-part test to weed out all those excuses about rivers and highways.
So a judge can't just look at a funny-shaped map and strike it down. They need mathematical proof.
Right, exactly. So first, the challengers have to prove the minority group is actually large enough and geographically compact enough to form a majority in a single normal-looking district.
Okay, so if they're just naturally spread out evenly across the whole state, you can't claim they were intentionally cracked.
Exactly. You have to prove they could have had their own logical district.
Okay, so you prove that, then what's the second step?
Then you have to show they are politically cohesive. Do they generally vote for the same candidates? Because if the group is split down the middle politically anyway, their voting strength isn't really being diluted by the map.
That makes sense. And the third part?
The third part is the hardest. You have to prove that the white majority in that specific area votes as a solid bloc to consistently defeat the minority group's preferred candidate.
Wow. So if you hit all three of those markers, the map is illegal. It basically proves the map makers use cracking as a weapon.
Yes. But here is the massive problem with relying on the courts to fix this.
It takes forever.
Yes. Proving those complex demographic voting patterns takes years of highly expensive litigation. By the time a map is finally ruled illegal and struck down by a judge, 2 or 3 election cycles might have already happened under those unfair lines.
The damage is already done.
Exactly. And that time delay is exactly what birthed the modern era of gerrymandering.
Right, because political operatives realized they didn't need to win lawsuits if they just controlled the initial maps.
Exactly. This is no longer local politicians tinkering in back rooms with highlighters. This is a highly funded national arms race.
And to really understand the current state of that arms race, you have to look at this staggering statistic from a letter written by former Attorney General Eric Holder.
This stat is wild.
It is. He pointed out that in the 2012 elections, Democratic congressional candidates received 1.4 million more votes nationwide than Republicans.
Think about that. Nearly 1.5 million more Americans voted for a Democrat than a Republican for Congress.
Yet when Congress actually convened, Republicans controlled 33 more seats than the Democrats.
33 more seats. More
votes overall, but vastly fewer seats in the House. We really need to pause and explain the mechanism there. How do state-level maps override a million-vote national advantage?
It all comes down to who holds the pen. You see, the federal government does not draw congressional maps. State legislatures do.
The state politicians, right?
Right. And the GOP understood this perfectly. They launched this brilliant, highly centralized strategy in 2010 called Red Map. Yeah. They realized that 2010 was a census year, which meant 2011 was a redistricting year.
So instead of spending all their money on expensive national congressional races, they flooded relatively cheap state legislative races with cash.
Exactly. They poured resources into flipping state houses in key battleground states.
Because once they won the state legislature, they controlled the pens that drew the congressional maps for the whole state.
Yes. And they used packing and cracking with surgical precision to lock in a massive structural advantage for the entire decade. They won the state houses, so they won the maps.
They won the maps, so they won the decade.
That's it. And that crushing defeat in 2012 forced the Democratic Party to realize they were basically bringing a knife to a gunfight.
And that realization is what launched the counteroffensive.
Right. In 2017, Eric Holder and former President Barack Obama launched the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, the NDRC.
And their explicit purpose was to counter RED map by building a massive operation heading into the 2030 census.
Yeah, and if you actually look at their 10-year timeline, the sheer scale of the operation is staggering.
Right. They aren't just drawing maps. They are trying to rewire the whole system. Let's walk through their strategy. Their first pillar is investing heavily in best-in-class mapping technology.
We are talking about state-of-the-art software like Maptitude, supercharged by artificial intelligence.
Which completely changes the game, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. In the past, map makers used basic demographic data, but now AI can parse incredibly granular data sets.
Like what kind of data?
Oh, it analyzes magazine subscriptions, grocery store buying habits, property tax records, and social media engagement.
Just to predict how a neighborhood will vote.
Exactly. It predicts exactly how a single neighborhood block will vote. The software can generate thousands of potential maps in seconds, optimizing for the exact partisan advantage the user wants.
But having the best software doesn't matter if you don't control the pen. How are they getting that power?
That is their second pillar electoral investment. Just like RediMap did, the NDRC spends millions to get the right Democratic politicians elected at the state level before lines are even drawn.
Okay, and that combines with their third pillar, which is grassroots mobilization to rally voters.
Right, getting people engaged locally.
And then their fourth pillar is heavily funding litigation to strike down Republican maps in court.
Which brings us to their fifth pillar, which is pushing for general redistricting reform at the state and federal levels.
But I have to push back here based on the sources.
Sure.
The NDRC uses the phrase fair maps constantly in their public messaging. But if you look at their actual IRS filings, which are public record, they literally state their legal purpose is to, quote, build a comprehensive plan to favorably position Democrats for the redistricting process.
Yeah, there's a real tension there.
It feels a bit like an athlete claiming they just want a fair game while simultaneously spending millions on the best performance-enhancing gear legally available.
And that tension is exactly what independent analysts and conservative critics highlight in these sources. The NDRC's public messaging focuses heavily on the high-minded ideals of democracy.
Right.
But their strategic investments in their IRS filings clearly demonstrate a highly partisan mission.
As the sources point out, it is nearly impossible to separate their call for fairness from their desire for political victory.
Exactly. Impartially speaking, they are a political organization designed to defeat Republicans.
This perfectly illustrates the massive gap between the ideal of fair maps and the reality of bare-knuckle political survival. And to truly understand that paradox, we have to look at the history of one of the NDRC's own founders, Barack Obama.
It is a remarkable piece of political history. Our sources from the Fulcrum and the conservative outlet Hot Air detail how Obama's early career was deeply shaped by gerrymandering.
Both as a victim and as a highly effective practitioner. Let's rewind to the year 2000.
Okay, so Barack Obama was a young, ambitious state senator in Illinois, and he decided to challenge a deeply entrenched incumbent named Bobby Rush in the Democratic primary for the U.S. House.
And Bobby Rush was no joke.
Not at all. He was a former Black Panther with incredibly deep roots in the community. He basically painted Obama as this out-of-touch, Harvard-educated lecturer who simply did not understand the average voter in the district.
And Rush just crushed Obama in the election.
Absolutely crushed him. But Rush didn't just want to win once. He wanted to ensure this upstart never challenged him again.
So he weaponized the map.
Yes, he did. Following the 2000 census, Illinois had to redraw its lines. Rush worked with a veteran political mapmaker named Kimball Brace.
And they essentially launched a surgical strike on Obama's neighborhood.
It's wild. They tweaked the boundaries of Rush's 1st congressional district by just a few blocks. They intentionally drew the new lines to run 1 block north, 2 blocks west, and 1 block south of Obama's house.
Wait, they literally carved his house out of the district?
Yes. They just went right around it.
That is the ultimate targeted cracking.
It was a brutal lesson in political geography, but the sources note that Obama learned from it very quickly.
He didn't just sit there and take it.
No. The very next year, in 2001, Obama was in a position to help redraw his own state Senate district, and he did not leave his fate to chance.
He worked with a Democratic consultant named John Corrigan to radically alter his 13th state Senate district. And the demographic shifts they engineered were not subtle at all.
No, according to the reports, they stretched the district upward along the lakefront. The new map made his district wealthier, whiter, more Jewish, and significantly less blue-collar.
So he intentionally cut out the blue-collar voters who had just rejected him in the race against Bobby Rush.
Right.
And he scooped up the wealthy donors and voters who would eventually fund his run for the U.S. Senate and later the presidency. He picked his voters to ensure his political survival.
Which makes his eventual shift in public stance so fascinating to observe. Because fast forward to 2016, Obama is in his final State of the Union address, and he forcefully calls for an end to gerrymandering.
He argues that we need to let bipartisan groups draw the maps.
Right. And this leads conservative critics to point out a deep irony which they dubbed the Obama gerrymander rule.
The Obama gerrymander rule. What's the argument there?
The argument from these conservative sources is that when Democrats use gerrymandering to protect their seats, like Obama did in 2001, is basically dismissed as routine politics.
He's playing the game.
Exactly. But when Republicans use the exact same tactics to gain an advantage, Democrats label it a power grab that undermines democracy.
The sources also highlight a crucial timeline issue here, right?
Yeah, during his first 2 years as president, Democrats held massive majorities in both the House and the Senate. Yet he spent zero political capital trying to pass nonpartisan redistricting reform at the federal level.
So he only launched a crusade against gerrymandering after the Republicans used Red Day map to crush the Democrats in the 2010 midterms.
Exactly. And it just highlights the central dilemma of this entire topic. Politicians of all stripes generally hate gerrymandering when it is used against them.
But they readily utilize it the moment they hold the pen.
Absolutely.
So after seeing how both parties ruthlessly exploit this system to guarantee their own survival, you really have to wonder, is there an actual way out of this partisan trench warfare?
It's the big question.
If politicians refuse to put down the weapon, can maps ever actually be fair?
Well, they can, but it requires completely taking the pen out of the hands of the political class.
Which they won't like.
No, they hate it. But the most prominent model for this is the Citizen Commission, specifically the intensely rigorous system they built in California.
Now, giving power to normal citizens sounds great in theory, but how do you actually execute it without accidentally appointing a bunch of political hacks who just rubber stamp a partisan map anyway?
It's a fair concern. California created the Citizens Redistricting Commission with a selection process designed specifically to weed out extremists and insiders.
Okay, how many people wanted to do this?
In 2010, over 30,000 California residents applied to be on this board.
30,000 average people wanting to dig through census data.
Yes, that's incredible.
Yes, and the vetting was extreme. They had to submit essays, provide letters of recommendation, and undergo deep financial and political background checks.
Wow.
Through a multi-layered process that even includes random selection lotteries and allows state legislative leaders to strike certain problematic candidates, they arrive at a final 14-member board.
And the partisan makeup of those 14 people is the real secret sauce, isn't it?
It is strictly balanced: 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents.
So no single faction has a majority.
Exactly. And the genius of the system lies in the voting rules. To approve a final map, the commission requires a supermajority of 9 votes.
Okay.
But crucially, those 9 votes must include at least 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 3 independents.
Wow, so you literally cannot pass a map without significant cross-party consensus. You are forced into company.
Right. If the map is too tilted, the other side simply vetoes it.
And voters across the country are responding to this idea, right? Yeah, in 2018 alone, voters in Colorado, Michigan, Missouri, and Utah all passed referendums to implement similar independent or semi-independent commissions.
But what if a state doesn't want to use a citizen commission? The New York Law School source highlights a completely different model for Massachusetts.
Yeah, the legislative cooperation model.
Right. This one proves that, occasionally, politicians actually can behave themselves if you change the environment they operate in.
Massachusetts is such a fascinating case study in transparency. In 2011, their state legislature, which is heavily dominated by Democrats, decided to handle redistricting themselves, but they completely overhauled the process.
What did they do differently?
They created a special joint committee.
So instead of locking themselves in a basement with the mapping software, they opened the doors.
Exactly. They held 13 public hearings all across the state. Over 4,000 residents attended.
We actually took direct testimony. They published the underlying demographic data online for anyone to see.
And they incorporated that public feedback before finalizing the lines. And the result speaks for itself. In a decade where almost every single state map across the country faced brutal litigation, the Massachusetts map faced 0 legal challenges, not 1.
0. That's unheard of.
It was widely accepted by both parties and the public simply because the process was transparent and inclusive.
Okay, so we have a California citizen veto model and the Massachusetts radical transparency model. Both clearly work. What is the catch?
The catch is human nature.
Right.
Politicians utterly despise giving up guaranteed power. Even when voters overwhelmingly demand fair maps, the political class fights back.
You mentioned Utah earlier. What happened there?
Well, the voters passed a citizen-led redistricting reform in 2018, but shortly after, the state legislature actively worked to repeal and gut the reforms, basically attempting to seize the power right back.
When politicians control the rules of the game, they do not want referees on the field.
Yeah.
You might be wondering how this invisible war actually impacts the ballot you fill out in November. We are constantly told that your individual vote is the absolute bedrock of democracy.
It's what we're all taught.
Exactly. But the mathematical value of that vote, whether it is a roaring voice in a tight election or a whisper completely drowned out in a packed district, is entirely dependent on where the lines of your district are drawn.
The lines literally dictate the outcomes before the ballots are even printed.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We live in an era of unprecedented technological advancement.
With the explosive growth of artificial intelligence and the incredibly precise software we discussed earlier.
Right. We currently possess the computing power to draw perfectly mathematically fair, beautifully competitive, and proportionally representative districts in a matter of seconds.
An algorithm could solve gerrymandering instantly.
But you have to ask yourself, do the humans currently holding the power actually want a machine to take away their most potent weapon?
It ultimately comes down to whether our leaders want mathematical accuracy or if they prefer structural advantage.
The technology is ready. The politicians are not. Remember, while they are the ones holding the pen, it is up to you to know exactly where you stand inside those invisible lines. Keep your eyes open. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.